What is the Master's name? Servant of Baha. You know that during Baha'u'llah's lifetime, Baha'u'llah called him the Master, or he had other terms for him like Sirullah, which means mystery of God, and many others. Shoghi Effendi lists some 20 or 30 different beautiful titles that Baha'u'llah bestowed on Abdul Baha. But when he took over the cause, when his father passed away, he selected for himself the name Abdul Baha, the name servant. He chose that out of all the names. He said, that is my name, that is my glory, that is the only thing I want to be called. So let's today talk about service. And when we talk about service, there are many different groups of people that Abdul Baha seemed to have a particular affection for, particular tenderness and love that Abdul Baha had for certain groups of people. Some of these groups were, one, the poor. Another group were the sick. Another group were the lowly or the downtrodden, those who have been laid low or have suffered in life. Another group were the unhappy, people that were not happy. Abdul Baha showed a particular affinity, love, and affection for. And yet another group that Abdul Baha longed to serve was a very special group. It was the Baha'is. Abdul Baha longed to serve the Baha'is. And there are other people as well. But I want to look at some of these groups of people and how Abdul Baha behaved towards them. Let's begin with the sick. First of all, do any of you know anybody that may get sick in the future? You know anybody that may get sick? Do you have neighbors or friends that may get sick and so on? Well, let's just think about these people as we read what Abdul Baha did. It says here, and this is in the book Vignettes from the Life of Abdul Baha, said, Abdul Baha's kind heart went out to those who were ill. If he could alleviate pain or discomfort, he always set about to do it. We are told that one old couple who were ill in bed for a month had 20 visits from the Master during that time in Akka. 20 visits. How many of you have visited one old couple or even any old person 20 times in a month? How many of you are busier than Abdul Baha? Shoghi Effendi said Abdul Baha's stupendous burdens were so great. He was dispatching 90 letters a day, and he was protecting the cause from the covenant breakers. He was receiving pilgrims. He was doing everything. And yet, for some reason, he considered it important to visit one elderly couple who was ill 20 times in a month. It goes on to say, he daily sent a servant to inquire about the welfare of the ill. And as there was no hospital in Akka, he paid a doctor a regular salary to look after the poor. The doctor was instructed not to tell who provided this service. So you see, Abdul Baha had a special affection for the sick. And so when he came to the United States on 17 June 1912, he gave a talk in New York City to the Baha'is. And I want to read you some of that. He says, we should all visit the sick. And as soon as I read that, I thought, oh, this is interesting. We should all visit the sick. Who does that exclude in this room? Who is not in the group of all? He says we should all visit the sick. When they are in sorrow and suffering, it is a real help and benefit to have a friend come. Happiness is a great healer to those who are ill. In the East, it is the custom to call upon the patient often and meet him individually. The people in the East show the utmost kindness and compassion to the sick and suffering. This has greater effect than the remedy itself. The visiting and giving happiness to the sick has greater effect than the remedy. Is anyone here a doctor? A doctor? I'm sorry to tell you this. I'm sorry to tell you this, but Abdul Baha says that we who are not doctors, by visiting the sick with love and compassion, has greater effect than the remedy itself. But of course, if you do both, I suppose it's even better. Now, Abdul Baha says, you must always have this thought of love and affection when you visit the ailing and the afflicted. It seems to me that this is a fairly easy thing to do because there's plenty of people that are ill all the time. So this is not a hard task. Maybe some of the other things we've talked about, they're not so easy. But like, say, teaching the faith, you may not be able to find someone to teach. But how many of you have any trouble finding someone who's sick? There's nobody. Your neighbors are sick. And any time they're sick, Abdu'l-Baha wants you to visit them. Let's look at another group of people that Abdu'l-Baha had particular love, tender affection for, and this was the poor. I'm going to tell you an interesting story. When Abdu'l-Baha was in New York, he came home one evening, and he was laughing really hard as he came into the apartment where he was staying. And he was laughing, but he was doing this, like this, holding his Abha's knees because he didn't have any pants on. And he walked in without any pants. And he thought this was really funny, and so he was laughing. And what had happened was, as he was walking home along Riverside Drive, he came across a man who was so poor that his pants were in tatters. And he said, "Psst, come behind the bushes." And he went behind the bushes. And he took his pants off, and he gave them to the man. And I'm thinking, what is this man thinking? I would love to talk to this man. That he's in New York City, and some Persian man takes him behind the bushes, takes off his pants, and gives it to him. Now, I want to ask you a question. How many of you have taken your pants off and given it to a poor person in the street? You haven't? Okay. Well, fortunately, Abdu'l-Baha had what they call an abad. It's a very long robe that covers, so he was able to get home. So I think we all better start wearing long abads. When Abdu'l-Baha was in New York also, he asked Juliet Thompson and Edward Getzinger to take some money, and he handed them each a 1,000-franc note. And he said, "Take this to the bank and convert it into quarters." And then he said, "I am in love with the poor." And the next day he took these bags of quarters and he went down to the Bowery Mission in New York, where the poor people are housed and sheltered and fed. And he had them all go into an auditorium and he spoke to them. I want to read you some of what he said. He said, "Tonight I am very happy, for I have come here to meet my friends. I consider you my relatives, my companions. I am your comrade. When Jesus Christ appeared, it was the poor who first accepted him, not the rich. You are his comrades, for he was poor, not rich. This earth's happiness does not depend upon wealth. While Baha'u'llah was in Baghdad, he left all he had and went alone from the city, living 2 years among the poor. They were his comrades. He chose for one of his names the title, the Poor One, and often in his writings refers to himself as Darvish, which means in Persian, poor. And of this title he was very proud. He admonished all that we must be the servants of the poor, helpers of the poor. Remember the sorrows of the poor. Associate with them, for thereby we may inherit the kingdom of heaven." Associate with the poor. I always thought if I wanted to inherit something, I should associate with the rich. That's what I would have thought. If I want to inherit lots of things, I should consort with the rich. And he says, no, with the poor, and thereby you'll inherit the kingdom of heaven. And he talked like this for some time longer. You can read the entire talk. But he finished with these words. He said, "And in conclusion, I ask you to accept Abdu'l-Baha as your servant." And then, before they could leave, he went to the back of the hall and stood where everyone left. And as they came out, he greeted each one and hugged every one of them individually. And then as he hugged them, he slipped them a few of these quarters. I want to ask you a question. What do you think is the greatest deed that man can do in the sight of God? Of all the things you can do before God, what deed is the greatest? Let me read you what Abdu'l-Baha says. He says, "No deed of man is greater before God than helping the poor. That's pretty strong words, isn't it? Let's read the whole talk. He's speaking to the Baha'is. He says, what could be better before God than thinking of the poor? For the poor are beloved by our Heavenly Father. When His Holiness Christ came upon the earth, those who believed in Him and followed Him were the poor and lowly, showing the poor were near to God. The poor are especially beloved of God. Their lives are full of difficulties, their trials continual, their hopes are in God alone. Therefore you must assist the poor as much as possible, even by sacrifice of yourself. No deed of man is greater before God than helping the poor. Spiritual conditions are not dependent upon the possession of worldly treasures or the absence of them. When physically destitute, spiritual thoughts are more likely. Poverty is stimulus toward God. Each one of you must have great consideration for the poor and render them assistance. Organize in an effort to help them and prevent increase of poverty. Those are powerful words, aren't they? That Abdu'l-Baha said. And this was one of the great examples that Abdu'l-Baha had, the way in which he longed to serve the poor and the sick. But it wasn't easy for the Baha'is to learn this lesson. And it was a hard lesson for many of us to learn, and maybe still is today. Someone who had difficulty or great pain in learning this lesson was Lua Getzinger. Lua Getzinger learned this lesson the hard way. When she went to Akka on pilgrimage, she was so delighted that Abdu'l-Baha asked her to do something for him. It says that when she was in Akka, Abdu'l-Baha said to her that he was too busy to call on a friend of his who was very poor and sick. Abdu'l-Baha must have loved this guy. He was poor and sick. You know, can you believe that? This guy, he had it made with Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha, he didn't have enough time, so he asked Lua if she could go in his place. He said to her, take food to the sick man and care for him as he had been doing. Lua felt so proud that Abdu'l-Baha had trusted her with some of his own work, and so she immediately went to the man's house. But she returned immediately in a state of excitement. Master, she said, you sent me to a very terrible place. I almost fainted from the awful smell, the dirty rooms, the degrading condition of that man in his house. I left quickly before I could catch some terrible disease. Sadly and sternly, Abdu'l-Baha gazed at her. If she wanted to serve God, he told her, she would have to serve her fellow man, because in every person she should see the image and likeness of God. Then he told her to go back to the man's house. If the house was dirty, she should clean it. If the man was dirty, she should bathe him. If he was hungry, she should feed him. He told her not to come back until all this was done. Abdu'l-Baha has done these things many times for this man, and she should be able to do them once. This is how Abdu'l-Baha taught Lua to serve. You know, Lua was one of the most outstanding believers we had, perhaps the greatest. I mean, when Abdu'l-Baha wanted to declare the covenant, he chose her out of all the Baha'is in the world to be the herald of the covenant. She was one of the greatest Baha'i teachers. He could have given her any task and she could have achieved it. She could have spoken to prime ministers or kings or rulers. She was outstanding, and yet this is the work he wanted her to spend time with. Why do you think he wanted that for her? Because I think he knew that she couldn't do any other work, important work, if she couldn't do this. If she couldn't learn to love and see God in all people, she couldn't do all that other important work that she was destined to do. It also makes me think about who are important people. You know, who are important people? Sometimes we think, oh, this person is important because they're rich or they're wealthy or they're in a high position and so on. We even have a term in English called VIPs, which stands for very important person. Even in Baha'i meetings, sometimes I go to a meeting and they say, well, these are our VIPs, look after them very carefully. Well, Abdu'l-Baha had his own set of VIPs. VIP to Abdu'l-Baha stands for very important poor. Those were his important people. He had a different sense of priority as to what was important work and who are important people. Now, I want to read you a statement of Abdu'l-Baha. It's a letter to a woman. And he's telling her how you should act as a Baha'i. It's in Star of the West. And he writes to her and he says, "To live the life, you must be the very kindest woman. You must be most pure. You must be absolutely truthful and live a perfectly moral life. Visit your neighbors when they are sick." Isn't that interesting? He's telling her what to do to be perfectly moral. And then the first example he says, visit your neighbors when they are sick. How many of you have neighbors? Okay, so Abdu'l-Baha's first example of how to live a moral life is to visit them when they're sick. Offer your services to them. Try to show them that you are longing to serve them. Feed the poor. Divide what you have. Be content to remain where God has placed you. Isn't that interesting? Be content to remain where God has placed you. In other words, everybody, wherever they are, God placed them there. Whatever circumstances you have in life, whatever has befallen you, even here and now in this room, God has placed you. And every moment of your life, whenever you're with a person, God placed you there. You must say to yourself, there is nobody on this planet or in all of creation that's more important to me than this person that God has placed in front of me. I'm not looking at my watch. I'm not looking across the room to other people that are maybe more important. No, God has placed me here, and I must be content with it and serve Him in this circumstance, no matter what happens to me. Be content to remain where God has placed you. Be faithful in your care to those to whom He has trusted you. So he's basically saying that everyone that comes in our path, God is giving them to us and trusting us with their care. Never waver in this. Show by your love you have something different, so that all will see and will say, what has this person that I have not? Show the world that in spite of the utmost suffering, poverty, sickness, you have something which gives you comfort, strength, and peace, that you are happy, serene, satisfied with all that is in your life. Then they too will want to possess what you possess, and will need no further teaching after you tell them what it is. And I want to read you one other statement from Abdu'l-Baha. He says, strive that your actions day by day may be beautiful prayers. Isn't that interesting? That there's other ways of praying apart from turning to God and speaking to Him. Actions, if they're done in the spirit of service, are also prayer. And he says, strive to make your actions prayers. So now you're praying much more during the day because your actions have been turned into prayers. Strive that your actions day by day may be beautiful prayers. Turn towards God and seek always to do that which is right and noble. The reason he says that, in my opinion, is that when you're serving people, if you're seeing God in them, when you see God in someone, then you're praying again. Because prayer is conversation with God. And now we can pray to God every time we serve a person because we're seeing God in them. Let's read this. Because now he's going to list a whole bunch of people that we need to serve. And I want to count them. Let's just count them right now, okay? Because now he's going to give examples of how to do this. He says, enrich the poor. That's 1. Raise the fallen. That's 2. Comfort the sorrowful. 3. Bring healing to the sick. Reassure the fearful. Rescue the oppressed. Bring hope to the hopeless. Shelter the destitute. There's 8 groups of people. Let's look at them. First, the poor. Do any of you know or ever encounter the poor? That's one group, Abdu'l-Baha says. Enrich them. 2 are the fallen. Do you know anybody in life that's fallen? Okay. 3, the sorrowful. Are there people that are sorrowful? There's lots of people that are sorrowful. And he says, comfort them. Bring healing to the sick. Reassure the fearful. How many of you know people that are fearful? The world is full of people that are fearful. He wants us to be reassuring to them. Rescue the oppressed. Bring hope to the hopeless. How many people are hopeless? Shelter the destitute. These are 8 things. How many of you would like to do these 8 things? We should memorize them. How important is this work? Abdu'l-Baha says right now, after he lists those 8 things, he says, this is the work of a true Baha'i, and this is expected of him. If we strive to do all this, then we are true Baha'is. But if we neglect it, we are not followers of the light, and we have no right to the name. Is that amazing? He lists these 8 things, these group of people that he wants us to serve, and he says, if we do these things, then we are true Baha'is. But if we don't do them, we are not Baha'is, and we have no right to the name. And I'm thinking, well, I hope that God, maybe doesn't see this in me, because I don't feel now I have right to the name. And then he continues, he says, God, who sees all hearts, knows how far our lives are in fulfillment of our words. I want to read that again. God, who sees all hearts, knows how far our lives are in fulfillment of our words. I want to read you a statement from Baha'u'llah. This is a very interesting statement because Baha'u'llah refers to another group of people. This group of people, he calls them the abased and the downtrodden. People who are abased or people who are downtrodden. There are such people everywhere in the world. And Baha'u'llah says this is what you need to do if you meet them. He says, if ye meet the abased or the downtrodden, turn not away disdainfully from them. For the King of glory ever watcheth over them, and surroundeth them with such tenderness as none can fathom, except them that have suffered their wishes and desires to be merged in the will of your Lord, the gracious, the all-wise. So he says, if you meet someone who is abased or downtrodden, do not turn away from them. He says, because God surroundeth them with such tenderness that no one can fathom. Every time you see someone who is abased or downtrodden, you need to see God surrounding them with tenderness. And then Baha'u'llah addresses the rich people of the earth with these words. He says, O ye rich ones of the earth, flee not from the face of the poor that lieth in the dust. Nay, rather befriend him and suffer him to recount the tale of the woes which God's inscrutable decree hath caused him to be afflicted. This is a very interesting statement because Baha'u'llah is quite specific here. He says, when you meet the poor, befriend them and also ask him to recount to you what he has suffered in life. He's telling you a very specific thing. It's not a general thing, love the poor. He's saying befriend the poor and then ask them to tell you, to recount to you what he has experienced. And then Baha'u'llah says what will happen if you do that. This is what's so interesting. If you do what he just told you to do, you befriend the poor and ask them to recount what they have suffered in their life, he says this is what will happen. He says, by the righteousness of God, whilst ye consort with him, the concourse on high will be looking upon you, will be interceding for you, will be extolling your names and glorifying your action. And I'm thinking, this is interesting. The concourse on high decides to come and visit you when you're meeting with the poor, the abased, and the downtrodden. For them, that's an important meeting. I would have thought when I'm going to proclaim to the president or the prime minister or some important person that maybe then the concourse on high will rush and assist me. Apparently, that's not an important meeting to them. But when you're having a meeting with the abased and the downtrodden and the poor, and you ask them to recount what they have endured in their lives, suddenly the concourse says, oh, that's a meeting I need to attend. That's the VIPs to the concourse on high as well. That's what they want to see. And Baha'u'llah continues to say, blessed are the learned that pride not themselves in their attainments, and well is it with the righteous that mock not the sinful, but rather conceal their misdeeds, so that their own shortcomings may remain veiled to men's eyes. And when I read this passage, and I think we've all read it many times, I didn't really realize how simple the message was from Baha'u'llah. Befriend the poor, befriend the lowly and the downtrodden, and ask them to recount what they have endured in their days. It's a very simple thing. This is what Abdu'l-Baha wanted for us. He wanted us to see who were the true VIPs. You know, there's another group of people that I still haven't mentioned that we also want to serve, that Abdu'l-Baha wanted to serve. The Baha'is. You know, Abdu'l-Baha constantly prayed not just to serve the cause, but to serve the servants of the cause. He says that I may serve thy cause and thy servants. I know many Baha'is, they want to serve the cause, but they don't want to serve the servants. I'll serve the Baha'i faith all I can, but don't ask me to serve these people. Don't ask me to serve these people. Abdu'l-Baha went so far as to say we should be ever willing to give our lives for the other Baha'is, our Baha'i friends. And when I read that, I said, no, Abdu'l-Baha, don't ask me to do that. Him, her, you want me to give my life? Fortunately, he didn't say you have to do it. He said you have to be willing to do it. This is the only way we can serve God, is to serve his servants. Because Abdu'l-Baha knew he was just one person. He only has 24 hours in a day. What can he do more than what he could do? Only that much. But if he could ignite service in every single Baha'i, then he can magnify by 1,000, by 1,000,000 his service to the cause. And this is really what Abdu'l-Baha longed to do. He prayed to be able to serve God's servants. And if we can learn to be so loving and helpful and encouraging and never discouraging, because what does encourage and discourage mean? Encourage means to give courage. That's where it comes from, that word comes from the root. To give courage to them. Discourage means to take their courage away from them. And if we can learn to be this way, then we are serving the cause infinitely more than anything we can do. And I mentioned last year an interesting concept which Cooper Dunbar mentioned. He said that everybody manifests the attributes of God. And one of the attributes of God is the unique one. The unique one, it's in the writings. And he said he thought for a while, how can he represent that? Because God is the only thing that's unique. And then he said, but if you think about it, everybody is unique. We are all unique. And because of this, every one of us has a role to play in God's plan. God raised up each and every one of you and each and every one of the Baha'is in your community. He raised everyone up because they have a role to play. And if they don't play that role, and if you don't play your role, nobody else can. Because you're unique. You're like a puzzle piece that fits in that spot in the puzzle. And if you do not put yourself in that spot in the puzzle, there's no other piece in all of creation to do that. And if we discourage anyone or prevent anyone from playing their role, the puzzle is incomplete. And if we encourage them to do so, then we are truly serving God's servants. And so this is the essential quality of Abdu'l-Baha that I wanted to talk about. The fact that Abdu'l-Baha longed to serve people, longed to serve mankind, longed to serve the poor, the sick, the destitute. There is nothing that we can do that's more important. We may think that we have such important work to do. We're so busy. But to Abdu'l-Baha, he had different priorities. And I believe that this is what we're called to do. We're called to have the attitude of service. Maybe if we just had this attitude, we wouldn't have to worry about teaching. We wouldn't have to worry about it. We wouldn't have to worry about anything, because this quality alone may be sufficient. Abdu'l-Baha was knighted for this work. He was knighted not because he was a Baha'i or the tablets he wrote or the covenant that he established. He was knighted because of the work he did amongst the poor in Palestine. And I believe that everyone in this room has been called upon by God to do this work. O wayfarer in the path of God, take thou thy portion of the ocean of his grace, and deprive not thyself of the things that lie hidden in its depths. Be thou of them that have partaken of its treasures. A dewdrop out of this ocean would, if shed upon all that are in heaven and earth, suffice to enrich them with the bounty of God, the Almighty, the All-Knowing, the All-Wise. With the hands of renunciation, draw forth from its life-giving waters, and sprinkle therewith all created things, that they may be cleansed from all man-made limitations. So what is he saying? My mind is boggling. He says that there's an ocean of God's grace, and just a dewdrop out of that ocean, just a dewdrop, is sufficient for all the bounties. And then he says we need to take with our hands of renunciation some of that water and then sprinkle it. He says sprinkle all created things with it. That's what we're doing. We're just little sprinklers. We take from the ocean of God's bounties what we get from it, and we sprinkle all creation. And I say, how could it be that God has allowed me to be the sprinkler of his dewdrops? How did he allow me to do this? And Abdu'l Baha answers it. From amongst all mankind, he hath chosen you. And your eyes have been opened to the light of guidance, and your ears attuned to the music of the company above. And blessed by abounding grace, your hearts and souls have been born into new life. Thank ye and praise God that the hand of infinite bestowals hath set upon your heads this gem-studded crown, this crown whose lustrous jewels will forever flash and sparkle down the reaches of time. Abdu'l Baha says, from amongst all mankind he chose you, and your eyes have been opened. And he says that he's put on your head this gem-studded crown. I want everyone now to close their eyes and see a crown on their head. And I want you to see the gems. And I want you to see God putting that crown on your head. And he says, this crown whose lustrous jewels will forever flash and sparkle down all the reaches of time. And then Abdu'l Baha says, to thank him for this, make ye a mighty effort, and choose for yourself a noble goal. Through the power of faith, obey ye the teachings of God, and let all your actions conform to his laws. And he talks like this, and he gives many examples of what you need to do. And he concludes with these words. He says, thus may each one of you be even as a candle casting its light, the center of attraction wherever people come together, and from you, as from a bed of flowers, may sweet scents be shed. So, to me, it seems quite obvious. We are called upon by God to very special work. Very special work. To become like Abdu'l Baha, the six things we have discussed, and now this final quality of service, which in my opinion, it completely informs every one of the other 5 attributes of Abdu'l Baha. Without this characteristic, which is what Abdu'l Baha first wanted Lua Getzinger to get right, without this characteristic of service, this attitude of service, I don't know if we can do all of the other things. So I saved it till last, but really it should have come first. And so I leave you with that final thought in this program of Abdu'l Baha's virtues. Thank you very much.